So this is kind of crazy to say, but we know the NBA Finals matchup. Yes, each series is 3-0. It's not quite done yet, but it's going to be Celtics Mavs. Mavs win game 3 against Minnesota to go up 3-0 in the series. And before we get to any kind of finals preview stuff, we have to talk about game 3 because this was as clear of a picture as we've gotten so far in the series as to exactly why the series has gone the way that it has. Dallas plays really well in the first half. They shoot significantly better than they had, certainly in game 1. And they just really looked like the better team. They felt like the more confident team. They felt like they knew exactly who they were. And while Minnesota was trying a couple of different options within their rotation, changing around their rotation, trying to get Ant going in the first quarter, while they were doing all that, Dallas was just doing exactly what they've been doing, rebounding, guarding, letting Luka and Kyrie create, and their role players were shooting the ball extremely well. And the pivot point in this game, and if Minnesota end up winning the game, this was going to be the headliner of it for me if I was, when I made the video. Derek Lively gets hurt in the second half, and that kind of changed everything for Dallas and for Minnesota because Lively's importance to this Mavericks team cannot be overstated. He has been not just better than Daniel Gafford, but significantly better than Daniel Gafford, especially in the way that Minnesota wanted to guard Luka. Minnesota wanted to trap Luka. They wanted to trap Kyrie. They didn't want those guys creating and making plays. And when Gafford was out there at the beginning of games and throughout his 20-25 minutes a game, he was not reacting well in some of these trapping situations where they were getting the ball to Gafford in the middle of the floor and they had all these options, or obviously he could attack and go to the rim. And Derek Lively was fantastic in those situations and in this game as well. He was making the correct pass. He has 1 to 2 dribble moves where he can get to the rim and finish. And it was just such a weapon for Dallas because Minnesota wanted to trap Luka, but they didn't really have the option of actually trapping Luka because Derek Lively was killing them. But then Lively gets hurt. Appears as though it's probably a concussion for him. So he misses the game. We'll see what he looks like moving forward for the rest of the series and probably the finals as well. But then in the second half, Minnesota starts to figure it out. They start to hit some shots. Ant has a pretty good quarter. Some of the other guys are starting to make shots, and we're starting to look at a game that I think Minnesota's going to win. I think that, the Lively thing just changed everything. We've got Dwight Powell minutes out there. No disrespect to Dwight Powell, but like season on the line for Dallas. Like you're going to the finals if you win the game, basically. And we've got Dwight Powell out there. Like that was tough. But then Gafford figured it out. He played pretty well in the fourth, and this is the defining thing about this series is once games get to the fourth quarter, it's been a thing in every single game. Prior to tonight, now Dallas had a lead a good amount of the night tonight, but prior to tonight, Minnesota was leading for 77% of the minutes in this series, despite being down 0-2. And the reason why is because of exactly what we saw in the fourth quarter of this game as well. I've talked about it in previous videos. Minnesota's offensive infrastructure around Anthony Edwards is just not as good as what Luka and Kyrie have with Dallas. Not to mention, obviously, Luka and Kyrie have each other, and at this point, they are better individual offensive creators, especially in the late game situations, than Anthony Edwards is. And this series has come down to essentially that. Yes, there's some rebounding numbers. Yes, you can talk about how these teams guard. You can talk about shooting differential from three-point range in each of these games. But what it's come down to is all these games have been close within the last 6 minutes, and Dallas has just been better in those last 6 minutes. And more specifically, their best offensive players have been better than Anthony Edwards. And Ant's 22. He's going to figure it out. He's young, but he wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be on the level of Luka and Kyrie. He wasn't ready to match those guys. And the secret about this Minnesota team throughout the season, as well as kind of during the postseason when everybody freaked out about how good they were playing, especially against Denver, is that they're an average offensive team. And they have been the entire season. They're really good on defense, but they are an average offensive team. And Cat and Ant, both individually, are really good offensive players. They both do things well. But if they're not making threes, they're not going to punch above their weight offensively, and they're really going to rely on their defense. And what Dallas is able to do at the end of these games is they're able to make these possession-by-possession games. And possession by possession, Luka and Kyrie are going to be better than most elite defenses, even a defense as good as Minnesota's. And the Timberwolves just don't have the ability to match that. And it's not even necessarily a personnel issue for them. It's just Ant's going to get better, and he's going to be that guy eventually, you hope. He's going to be on that Kyrie Luka level, but he's just not right now. And the advantages that we saw for Minnesota in the previous rounds, which was, defense, rebounding, their size, their length, those advantages don't exist in this series for them against Dallas. And they've been almost as good as Dallas for all three of these games, with the exception of the last 6 minutes. The first 42 minutes of every single game, Minnesota was right in this. They could easily be up 3-0 in the series. It's not hard to see that happening, but Dallas has executed better down the stretch, and Dallas has been the better team at the end of these games, and ultimately that's what matters, and also, by the way, makes Dallas an extremely dangerous team if they do move on and play Boston potentially in the finals. And not to be too reductive about the entire matchup, but sometimes it just comes down to who has the best player in the series. And Luka has been the best player in the series, and Kyrie's been right there with them. And Ant has struggled. I mean, I think coming into the game tonight, Ant and Cat together were, shooting like 35% from the field or something. The team from Minnesota as a whole weren't shooting twos well. They weren't shooting threes particularly well, at least not above average. And that's just not going to be sustainable for Minnesota. There were so many times where Ant was creating, he was driving, he was playmaking. He had a pretty good scoring and facilitating game. But down the stretch, he didn't have it, and there were moments, whether it be down the stretch or throughout the game, where he would create good opportunities for Cat or other guys. I mean, McDaniels had a pretty good shooting night, but nobody else really shot the ball particularly well from three for Minnesota. And if those guys aren't going to be hitting shots and there's no other creator, like Ant is going to get doubled, and he's going to have to try and make these plays. And the difference between the answers for what Minnesota had against these doubles and these traps for Dallas compared to what Dallas had in terms of answers against doubles and traps, it was a night and day difference, truly. And so Dallas wins the game, and it appears as though they're going to move on to the finals, and I would presume play against Boston. And it's a really interesting matchup because Boston the entire season has been the best team in the league, certainly by the numbers, of course, record-wise. And at times they haven't been particularly impressive in the postseason, but to this point, they've only lost 2 postseason games. So like they might not look, really impressive game to game, but they're winning the games, right? Obviously, they have the easiest path we've ever seen probably to get to the finals. But once they end up matching up against Dallas, it's truly going to be fascinating. I would assume at that point that Lively would be back for Dallas and that Kristaps Porzingis would be back for Boston. And Boston is just going to be a different beast with Porzingis back. I mean, I know they haven't looked, fantastic during the postseason, but with KP out there, they're just different. They're just that much better because of what he provides them offensively against some of these switching defenses. And Boston has a lot of really good matchups for what Dallas likes to do, right? Like they have length and size, but they also have guys that are pretty strong. Obviously, Drew Holiday, Derek White, Jaylen Brown, like really more what you need against Luka is like length is good, and McDaniels has done decent against him, but like you need a couple of options to keep throwing at him, and you need guys that are pretty strong. And I feel like Boston matches up pretty well there. But at this point, I would honestly say that's an even series. Like Dallas-Boston, I think, is an even series going into the finals. And it's going to be really fun having Kyrie go back into Boston and deal with that whole situation. And it's going to be really fun watching Luka and Tatum, each of them, go for their first ring. Obviously, Jaylen Brown as well. But like seeing those guys go at it with an opportunity to each get their first title and an opportunity they might not get again. So Dallas's path to get here has been incredible with the trade deadline acquisitions, with how well they've played in the postseason, especially against the Minnesota team that 2.5 weeks ago everybody thought was the best team in the league. People kept mentioning that it felt like Denver, Minnesota was basically the finals because they were the 2 best teams in the Western Conference. But realistically, Dallas has been probably the most impressive postseason team in the entire playoffs. Also kind of makes you wonder how good OKC is if they were able to take 2 games off these guys, because right now Dallas is just a well-oiled machine. Their role players are playing well. They're hitting shots. They're guarding. Luka and Kyrie are finishing games well. And they have a formula that is just going to be incredibly difficult to stop, regardless of the team, regardless of how well Boston has played this season, regardless of how many threes they shoot, how well they shoot from 3. Dallas just has a formula right now that they feel like if they can get to the end of these games, 6 minutes to go, they're better and they're going to win. And by the way, if it was against Boston, they're going to have that exact same advantage. Tatum's very good, but Luka's the best player in the series. Luka and Kyrie together are significantly better late game scorers than either Tatum or Brown. The advantages that they've experienced in the last 6 minutes of these games against Minnesota is also going to be there against Boston, which again just provides another wrinkle to what I expect will be a very interesting series, presuming we get there. If you watch this video a week from now and all of a sudden Minnesota's tied it up 3-3 and we're going to a game 7, then come back and comment something and tell me I'm crazy. But right now, it looks like we have our finals matchup, and it looks like it's going to be Boston-Dallas for a shot at the title.